What are your night shift horror stories? When I was at a youth center, we were getting ready to go to sleep when some sort of storm hit. The air conditioners filled with dust from outside. And the lights went out and then on and then off. Then flickering like in the horror movies. Every single light in the halls were flickering like that. Later, we smelled smoke and the staff went looking. It turned out to be a fan that had started burning. The smoke got really bad. But since we were all high risk, we were forced to stay in one area because all of the doors unlocked during a power outage. It was boring as shit. Never found out why the lights were flickering and what was going on in the first place. Tried to work on some program at 3 a.m. as the operations were going smoothly. Did /rmrf/ in my home directory. Kids, don't use /rmrf/ and don't try to do any smart work late at night. I used to work night shift as a care aide in an old folks home. It was already creepy. The home was an old hospital that was converted. Some asshole kept walking around the courtyard after dark dressed as the Grim Reaper knocking on doors. It was actually really scary. He ran off and the facility got a security guard for a few weeks. Worked as a security guard, did a week-long gig working from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. during setup and the 3 days of the concert itself. First had a plague of locusts during setup. Then on the second night of the concert, one of my supervisors got targeted by a drunk patron who he kicked out earlier. The guy punched him so hard knocked his orbital socket loose. Finally on the third night, just when I thought things were calming down, we had the worst mass shooting in US history take place. I had to keep 6 people from bleeding out till cops arrived in my area backstage about an hour and a half later. I'm a warehouse security guard in Indiana. I started on midnights and have since moved to 2NDS. It was around 4 a.m. and I was in the exterior part of my perimeter tour, and since no one was there I was singing a song. Just something I like to do while I'm alone. I picked up the habit in scouts when we would go on hikes, so I'm outside. It's maybe 100-foot walk to the door I'm supposed to re-enter the warehouse with. I hear footsteps and an awful voice singing the same song behind me. I whip around and this dude who's basically emaciated. His eyes are bulging. And he's got a bunch of pockmarks on his face is walking behind me. I shit you not. My asshole was so tightly puckered I could have sucked in a bicycle. Some fucking meth or crack addict had snuck up on me and he was less than 15 feet away. I asked him who he was and why he was here. He didn't respond and just kinda watched me. I told him this is private property and is closed at this time. He needs to leave now or I'm calling the police. He looks around, scratches his arms a bit and turns and walks away, looking back occasionally. He finally left property, and when I was absolutely sure he was gone I bolted into the door. Scariest night I've had working there. If he hadn't started singing he could have done whatever he wanted to me. I have tinnitus and sometimes I hear noises that aren't actually there. When I hear footsteps nowadays I typically just chalk it up to I'm hearing a faint echo. Because that's what it typically always is. Now whenever I hear anything I look to see what it was. I told my supervisor in the morning that I had to kick a person off property cause they were loitering after hours. Supervisor just kinda told me that stuff like that happens and it's fairly normal this close to the edge of inner Indy. Used to work night shift at a middle school. Every night while cleaning out the boys' locker room I would hear at least one locker slam shut. Sometimes more. This creeped me out when I started, but after a couple of months I got used to it. One night while cleaning one of the girls' locker room, I heard a girl scream. I walked out of the locker room. Even looked outside the building. Didn't see anybody. But before that I worked at the high school. I'd randomly hear doors open and close. Nowadays I work day shift at another school. About a year ago I just got to the building to begin my shift. It was still dark out and I was turning on all the lights. When I walked by the main office I heard what sounded like someone ransacking the place. Papers being tossed. I heard what sounded like a table or file cabinet being dragged. I remember my first thought was, man, somebody must have lost something important. Then I clicked. It was 6 in the morning and it was either Thanksgiving or Christmas break, meaning there was no school and there shouldn't be anybody in there. It took me a second to work up the courage to go in and check it out. When I did, nobody was there and nothing was out of place. Finally, last month I get a call from dispatch at 3 a.m. The fire alarm was going off and they needed somebody to go turn it off. As soon as I walk in I freak out. The alarm is blaring, but what scared me was the strobe light that flashes with the alarm. The building was pitch black except every other second when that strobe lit the halls up. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie where they're looking for the killer. I was half expecting to see someone pop up out of nowhere when the halls lit up. I worked in a residential treatment center for teen girls. One girl with some severe trauma, rape abuse, came sleepwalking into the room screaming to please untie her while clawing at her wrists. She was begging me to help her because he's torturing me. I sat her down and pulled her bracelets and watch off. She went completely limp, then got up and went back to bed. It freaked me out seeing the raw emotion of her trauma since she was always smiling and relatively calm during the day. Another time I was doing my nightly checks and a guy suddenly walked out from behind the door coming at me. I screamed and threw my flashlight at him. It was a smiley face balloon. I worked in an open quarry mine down in Texas. We had this storm where it rained like a motherfucker for hours and hours. Being night shift, 6:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m., supervisor. I was in charge of 8 Cat 745 haul trucks, 2 Cat 390 excavators, 6 Cat 980 loaders, 2 D8 dozers, and 1 D9 dozer. It was about 2 a.m. when I had 3 haul trucks get stuck in the bottom of the mine, just spinning their tires endlessly. It was horrible. Since we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars of production per shift, I had to get permission to shut the mine down from the superintendent and relay that to the supervisors up in the plant that washes/dries the material, frac sand. They wouldn't shut down because I said so. I called him at minimum 13 times within an hour to get him to shut the mine down. Since it was 2 a.m., he never answered, which never happened as he always had his phone on. 3 to 4 of us were soaking wet and covered from head to toe in mud to the point where you couldn't even tell we were wearing neon green high-vis safety gear. We got the trucks pulled out of the mine after roughly 3 hours of using a combo of the dozers and loaders and excavators to essentially build a new road from drier materials. The superintendent got in at 6 a.m. for the 6:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. shift. Took one look at the mine and shut it down for the day. Turns out his phone charger came unplugged and his phone died in the middle of the night. Never knew I called. I worked as a cab driver some years ago and had a night shift during the weekend. I was about to end my shift but got a last-minute call for a ride. Thinking I didn't mind the extra money, I accepted and picked him up. When I arrived, first of all I called back to let him know I was ready and waiting outside. But there was no answer. I called 3 times. Where I live and in the taxi company I worked for, we as drivers have a right to start the meter 10 minutes after arrival if the passengers has not shown themselves. So after 10 minutes I start the meter since the waiting was costing me both money and sleep. After about 30 minutes the passenger finally arrives and gets in the cab. Everything seems to be alright for a few minutes until he checked the meter. At which point he started throwing a gigantic tantrum saying he was not going to pay and he was going to report me to the police for fraud. I calmly explained the laws and rights of both drivers and passengers to him, telling him I was even willing to stop the meter early just to be decent. He still refused and got even more pissed. He was sitting in the back seat directly behind me. And out of nowhere I feel the edge of a knife resting on my throat. He told me he would slit my throat if I didn't revert the meter to minimum fare. Note, I was still driving at this point. I again calmly recommended he put down the knife and told him I could stop the meter even earlier if it meant so much to him. But he decided to press the knife harder against my throat instead. I immediately slammed the brakes. He face planted into the driver's seat. The knife dropped into the mid-console and I even did a bit of a drift. Then I quickly got out of the car and hard locked it from the outside with him still struggling to get his seatbelt off. The alarm button in my cab was also activated, which immediately sends a distress signal to police, fire department, ambulance and every single cab in the city. 2 police cars arrive along with 3 cabs, 1 ambulance and 1 fire truck. Needless to say, he is not getting out of jail anytime soon. The scenario was caught on tape and video from the camera inside the cab. I still haven't been paid for that cab fare though. More of a very weird event. Sometimes work night shifts. One time was going home around 4 a.m. or so. It was pitch dark outside and very quiet. Person on a bike came out of nowhere. Said he remembered me from middle school, even said the right school name. And rode off. Mine's pretty boring but a repetitive hell. I had to work through college. And I had to do this during the lead up and fallout of the 2008 recession. I had a job. And there weren't any to go looking for. I worked at Wendy's. Near a highway on-ramp. 5 miles from a large outdoor amphitheatre, think Warped Tour / Ozfest etc. No matter if there was a concert that night or not. At 5 p.m. on the dot half the crew went home. I got so fast at making burgers it was a legit problem when some assholes ordered 20 junior bacons and then did a drive-off. I worked at a regional radio station in the middle of fucking nowhere. Australia. I was the overnight operator, keep the overnight playlist running. Set up for the morning. Do all the manual checks for the next day. And jump on the desk if anything funky happens. I spent a lot of time sitting in what was essentially a tin shed in the middle of a paddock. With my dog. Shoes off. Listening to 50s and 60s music and doing crossword puzzles. Except one night when the roo shooters came through. They spooked the kangaroos in the paddock. And one of them jumped headfirst through our office window. So there's me, barefoot and half asleep. When this 6-tall kangaroo smashes through the glass window. Blood and glass everywhere. My dog starts chasing the kangaroo. I'm chasing my dog. And the kangaroo bounds around the office. Knocking shit off desks in the dark. Bleeding everywhere. I ran and opened the studio bay doors. And my dog chased it outside. Where? I'm assuming. The poor thing was shot. Then I had to call my boss. Thanks for watching.